So this is chapter 5, which is on human development. We will go through the different stages of lifetime or human development and look at a few aspects of each of those. The first stage is prenatal development. And there are 3 stages within prenatal development. First is the germinal stage, which is the period from conception to implantation in the uterine wall, and that lasts about 2 weeks, so not very long. Next, there's the embryonic stage, which is the period from implantation until around the 8th week of pregnancy. At this time, major body system organs take form and gender is determined. The last stage is the fetal stage, which is the period from the end of the embryonic stage until birth. So let's look at childhood, which obviously comes after the birth. Let's look at physical development in childhood. Major changes take place in height and weight in the first 2 years, as I'm sure you all know. Also changes in motor development. The child will progress from rolling over, sitting up, standing to walking, so huge changes. Their perceptual development, which is the way the child views the world, will also change. So let's look at cognitive development within childhood, which we know cognitive is simply the way you think. Jean Piaget's theory had several stages. The sensory motor stage, which occurs between birth and approximately age 2. Throughout this stage, infants are increasingly able to respond to and learn from their environment. For example, at 4 to 8 months, an infant will likely be able to make a connection between pressing a button on a toy and making a song play. This stage is primarily when an infant learns how they can interact with and affect their environment. Another stage is the pre-operational stage, which occurs between the ages of 2 and 7, and we know between 2 and 7 the child really develops a lot of language skills. And one aspect of this stage is called egocentrism, which means that the child thinks that everyone views the world the same way they do. In other words, they are not able to put themselves in someone else's shoes. And then comes the concrete operational stage, which occurs between the ages of 7 and 12. Children in this stage are less egocentric. They're now able to see the world from another person's perspective and put themselves in another person's place. We looked at cognitive development, on to moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg asks, how do children determine how they behave? And he identified 3 different stages. The pre-conventional level lasts through approximately the age of 9, and in this level, children primarily base their behavior on whether the behavior is rewarded or punished. So I'm going to do this behavior because I get rewarded, or I'm not going to do this behavior because I'll be punished. Then the child moves on to the conventional level. At this point, when choosing a behavior, children begin to then consider standards of their parents, of their culture, of society. So they're not only basing their behavior on reward and punishment, but also what are the standards of society? What does your parents believe is okay or appropriate behavior? Another theory that comes along with childhood is Mary Ainsworth's theory of attachment, which is defined as the emotional tie between a child and their caregiver and is related to the quality of care a child receives. There are 4 types of attachment that she identified, which are secure, avoidant, ambivalent, resistant, and disorganized, disoriented. I know your textbook goes into much more detail about each of these types of attachment, so definitely check that out if you have any further interest in that. So let's move from childhood to adolescence. Initially, let's look at physical development in adolescence. We know that this phase usually includes a major growth spurt, also includes the onset of puberty, which is when secondary sex characteristics begin to appear. Those could be body hair, voice changes, and for females, rounding out of breasts and hips, and many other things. During puberty, the male body secretes higher levels of testosterone, and the female body secretes higher levels of estrogen. So let's talk about cognitive development, thinking as an adolescent. Let's go back to Piaget's theory. He had one more phase of cognitive development, and that is called formal operations. This occurs around the age of 11 or 12. However, for some it occurs later, and some people never reach that level of formal operations. So what is formal operations? It's essentially the ability to think abstractly. Well, what does thinking abstractly mean? I included this definition below of abstractly. Is considered a higher order reasoning skill. You use it when you create things, speak figuratively, solve problems, understand concepts, analyze situations, form theories, and put things in perspective. In other words, it's just a higher level of thinking than a concrete thinking ability. And now let's go back to Kohlberg's theory of moral development. He also had another phase called the post-conventional phase. If this level is reached, it usually occurs during adolescence. However, again, many individuals never reach this level. But in the post-conventional phase, behavior is based on someone's personal moral standards. It's no longer based on just rewards and punishment or the standards of your parents or society, but you have an internal personal moral standard, moral code that you go by. So social development in adolescence is huge. Teens are more sensitive to rejection than adults. I think we would all agree with that. They're more sensitive to peer pressure and rejection. And in adolescence, they begin to focus on questions regarding who they are and try on identities to see what looks good and feels comfortable. So personality development in adolescence. Erik Erikson proposed 8 stages of personality development from infancy to late adulthood. I'm not going to read through the whole chart, but it's a great thing to review if you're interested in personality development and how we develop through our lifetime with our personality. What comes after adolescence would be emerging adulthood, which includes ages 18 to 25. As you can see from the little picture, there's often continues to be identity exploration, trying on different things to figure out what your identity is. There can be some instability because you're going from being a teenager, possibly living at home and having financial help, to being expected to live on your own. So some instability. Self-focus, being very focused on the self and progressing yourself. Feeling in between, again, just like the instability. But there are also many possibilities, many things that could happen and to look forward to in emerging adulthood. After emerging adulthood occurs young adulthood, which is usually by the mid-20s. And then is when people complete or start completing the key developmental tasks of emerging adulthood, which it could include getting married, it could include pursuing higher education, could include becoming a parent. And speaking of becoming a parent, there are 4 different parenting styles that are identified in your textbook. These are authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved. And again, I'm not going to include definitions or go into depth about each of those, but certainly look in your textbook to find more information on each of those. So after young adulthood comes middle adulthood, which is between the ages of 40 to 65. Most people in this age range have established a career. Unfortunately, there may be possible hearing and vision loss. This may begin at these ages. And your personality tends to become whole and balanced. You tend to become an individual who you know who you are, and you definitely experience individuation. Following middle adulthood comes late adulthood, which would be considered 65 and over. In late adulthood, fluid intelligence, which is raw mental ability, pattern recognition, and the ability to think abstractly, can decrease. And also crystallized intelligence, which essentially is your knowledge base, what you have learned and practiced, can also decrease. So that's unfortunate that we can lose the fluid and crystallized intelligence. You could be in the stage Erik Erikson identifies as integrity versus despair. Have you lived the way you wanted to, or are you in despair because you haven't? Also, there's the huge thing of confronting death, which can be really tough for some people in late adulthood. Physically, there's an increase in brittleness of bones, wrinkles, and fine lines, possible continued sight and hearing loss, and possible impact on sexual functioning. So we've briefly gone through each stage of adulthood, well, childhood and adulthood. So if you have any questions, please let me know, especially more details about parenting styles or types of attachment that we didn't really get into detail about. And just any questions at all. Thank you.